you everyone for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're located today. Thank you for joining our webinar on the new 2025 OFAC advisory. Today with me is our amazing panel of experts. We have Erik Woodhouse, who is partner of international trade at Crowell Moring, Tom Keatinge, the director of Center of Finance and Security at RUSI, and my longtime webinar partners, Daniel Martin, partner at HFW, and Simon Ring, director of Global Trade and Shipping at Windward. Thank you for joining us today. We're very excited. Before we're going to start, just some quick housekeeping rules. This webinar is under the Chatham House rules, meaning no independent recording or quoting, please. We will share the recording with everyone at the end. And if you have any questions, please use the Q&A section at the bottom. We'll allocate some time at the end for questions. And if we won't have time to answer all of them, we'll make sure to get back to you offline after the webinar. So with that, I think we can start. We've gathered here today to discuss the new OFAC advisory of 2025. And while it wasn't, as we discussed here before the panel of experts, it wasn't a revolutionary advisory or a louder one than the one that came out in 2020, it still was published and made everything a lot more clear for stakeholders that sanctions and list screening is not enough anymore. It was way more drilled down, and we're going to go over that in a second about what's changed since 2020 to 2025. And we hope to give you some clarity about what good compliance looks like after this new advisory, what are the regulators' expectations from stakeholders, and how you can leverage technology, or what is the next step you can do with the technology that you have to make sure that you're aligned with everything. So with that, I think we can dive straight in. We're going to start with you, Daniel. Can you set the stage for us a little bit about how the 2025 guidance differs from everything we've seen until now?
Of course, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us. I think you're right, Hila. I think really what we're talking about is evolution rather than revolution. I think if we think back to where we were back in 2020 and the tri-agency guidance, that's sort of 35 pages. It runs through a lot of detail, but also covers a range of different activities. And where the current guidance is really, I think, a refocusing of the industry's attention on maritime compliance. It was published as part of President Trump's policy of maximum pressure on Iran, and it's very targeted and focused on Iranian deceptive practices that enable Iran to continue exporting oil. What it does do is it updates some of the guidance from historically, clear that 2020 guidance remains in place, and important not to forget that there's a 2024 October compliance communique, which is a useful document, sets out some practical case studies. But really what it does is it brings us up to date. I say it's more specific and it's more targeted. I think it's interesting in terms of bringing us up to date that there are a number of concrete examples within the 2025 guidance. I would encourage people to look carefully at those lessons learned. And I think really those are in there to demonstrate to the industry that this is a real concern and that these are things that actually happen, and as evidence that OFAC will enforce and will designate. And therefore people need to take it seriously. More explicit about the use of the shadow fleet. I think it's a term that we've all got used to thinking about in the context of Russia, but explicitly drawing that link between the use of the shadow fleet and Iranian activities. And therefore, I know we'll come on and talk about diligence and technology, but those issues that we're familiar with in the Russia context, equally applicable. I think it's worth highlighting the 5 key types of deceptive practice that the advisory identifies. Firstly, there's a focus on STS activity. What is interesting to me, at least, is it talks about cargoes that are being moved through multiple STS transfers for a single parcel of cargo. And therefore, when it comes to compliance programs and due diligence, looking for that sort of activity is absolutely key. And I think, I'm sure we'll talk about this, but the guidance always has 2 functions. It's out there as helpful guidance to educate the industry as to things to think about, and therefore to some extent it can be used as a shield for the industry, things to know, to look out for. But it's also a sword for the regulator. The regulator will say, we told you about this risk, and therefore you need to deal with it. And therefore, I think if people haven't read the guidance carefully, they should do so because of that concern. So yes, I talked about STS, a repetition of a historic focus on false documents, both relating to the cargo and the vessel. But here in the context of Iran, it's very much a focus when we talk about false documents on concealing the origin or the destination of the cargo. So whether that's through fraudulent documents, whether that's manipulating actors to produce new documents, really that focus on the pieces of paper. And we've collectively talked before about the difficulties that actors in the industry face, because sometimes we are in a paper-based industry rather than a product-based industry. And therefore, getting behind the pieces of paper can be a challenge. Thirdly, so usual focus on vessel location. I think it's clear that we've moved from early days of AIS switch off, much more concerned now with AIS manipulation, whether that's spoofing location, spoofing identity, those sorts of things, and a heavy focus on that. And then fourthly, looking at complex ownership, complex structures that are being put in place to conceal the involvement of designated persons. Fifth and final thing that I'll say before handing over to others is one thing that is new in this advisory is a focus on complex brokering networks, and really that focus on those individuals who are engaged in brokering the sales of the cargoes, and a real spotlight on the information that they have and their involvement in producing documents. So I think what it shows is that the regulator, as ever, is always looking at the totality of the actors who are involved, and their emphasis will change over time.
Sorry, thank you. Definitely, I completely agree with everything. And I want now to turn to Erik, from your past experience from the regulatory sphere. Let's say, how do you see the difference between the 2020 advisory to the new 2025?
Thank you, Hila, and thanks to my fellow panelists and to the audience for being with us here today. So I want to, you'll hear me echo, I think, many of the comments that Daniel made, but hopefully add some different perspective as well. Obviously, both advised, I was mostly viewed the 2025 advisory in comparison to the 2019 advisory that also looked specifically at Iran. Both of those were focused on Iran, but the context and the nature of the challenge that the government is addressing have become very different in the intervening years. To simplify a bit, during the era of the JCPOA, Iran obviously exported oil to a number of countries. So after the US exited the agreement and reimposed sanctions, the major challenge was to reduce that existing oil trade while also deterring the emergence of illicit trade networks. Fast forward to today, and Iran has had years to rebuild its capacity or build its capacity initially to export oil under the risk of sanctions, including smuggling networks and increasingly sophisticated ways to facilitate shipping and payment despite the sanctions risks involved. As Daniel mentioned, separate from Iran, the issue of the dark fleet and maritime evasion practices have become a much broader challenge as a result of Russia's attempts to circumvent the oil price cap and other sanctions. OFAC has maintained a steady stream of advisories focused on the maritime sector overall. So I agree with Daniel's comment. What this advisory does is it provides an opportunity to make clear the government's current focus on Iran, but also to bring the guidance with respect to Iran up to date in light of all the work that's gone into the maritime sector in recent years. You can see this evolution if you look at the differences between the 2019 advisory and the 2025 advisory. So in detailing Iran's deceptive practices, there's much more detail now on AIS and location manipulation, more detail on complex vessel ownership and management structures, and a new section on obscure oil brokers that Daniel also mentioned that have emerged as critical links between sellers and buyers, especially in China. And in detailing key steps to identify and mitigate the sanctions risks, the new advisory provides a lot more detail on insurance verification, reflecting the growth of the dark fleet of aging vessels and questionable insurers and insurance practices. Although conducting diligence on flag registration and on vessels in general was acknowledged in the earlier advisory, the new version has a new section that emphasizes the importance of verifying flag registration and an explicit emphasis on know your vessel or KYV diligence. Mirroring the emphasis on AIS manipulation and steps to obscure location information, the advisory also adds a discussion of monitoring for vessel location data manipulation, no longer just turning off of AIS. And there's a new section on the importance of appropriate contractual terms to exit or terminate to terminate agreements when performance would violate or cause a U.S. person to violate U.S. sanctions. And there's an interesting note there that from OFAC saying ideally the termination could also be on the basis of deceptive practices alone. Finally, the advisory calls on port agents, operators, and terminals to refuse service and entry to sanctioned vessels. And I thought the new advisory has an interesting focus on maritime jurisdictions, port operators, and service providers, which I think expands the aperture, at least the explicit aperture, a bit from the prior advisories to focus on this broader ecosystem of actors and to explicitly convey that there are risks for those actors as well. So you see a much broader and more detailed focus on equipping the private sector to identify risks of sanctions evasion in the maritime sector and to terminate or decline relationships that would facilitate that evasion. This is, to build on one of Daniel's comments, this is both helpful to the private sector and consistent with the view and the government's understanding that the private sector is the front line of implementation. These relationships get declined or terminated because the private sector is identifying the risks and then taking steps to terminate or decline relationships. But as Daniel mentioned, it is also a sword for the regulator and a warning that they expect the private sector to be reviewing and internalizing all of this guidance. And I'll just close by saying, to sum up, that I think all of this is commensurate with the U.S. government's policy goals, both on Iran at this time and sanctions evasion generally, given the growth and the increasing sophistication of the dark fleet and related dark fleet practices.
For sure. Thank you. We completely agree. And as you both mentioned, this new advisory, the 2020 advisory listed, I think it was around 7 deceptive shipping practices that were very vague. And this time round, they narrowed it down to 5, as Daniel mentioned them. They're much more, I feel, baked into what exactly stakeholders need to look at and what they need to do to mitigate them. And also they've given them a way out to terminate contracts and terminate deals based on deceptive shipping practices and not just sanctions until it was how it was accepted until now. So they really gave them a way out in a way. And that leads me, Simon, to you. As the regulator narrowed it down to just a few main deceptive shipping practices that stakeholders need to look at, can you take us through them, exactly how they evolved? What is it about them that made the regulator really drill down on them? And as Simon will speak, we're gonna post a little poll about these new deceptive shipping practices that have been refocused in the new advisory. We would love to see what you, from your business and organization perspective, care about the most or poses the most challenge to you today.
Thanks, Hilla. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, good evening, wherever you are. It's interesting, actually, listening to Daniel and Erik talking there. And I think anyone that remembers vividly the 2020 advisory, I spent quite a bit of time working with what was David Payman's team in Washington and the State Department and OFAC, talking to them, discussing pre the launch of that advisory. And I think what is very prevalent, I'm fortunate to work with the panelists here and Tom's amazing teams at RUSI and CFS in the task force. And the conversations that you're having today with regulators are very different to conversations back in the 2018, 2019s, or the right up to it, and all the work that State and Treasury did in their sort of global round trip in embassies and so on ahead of that. But I mean, in the last quarter, I think we've seen more vessels designated than we've ever seen in that period. And again, some of the conversations we're having with regulators, we're starting to understand that when we're looking very closely at the overlap. So if you look at the 3 primary regulators, the UK, the US, and the EU, that designate vessels, we're starting to see less overlaps and understanding why that's happening. there's a lot of resource and time and effort that goes into designations. And I think it's prevalent that we're starting to see those overlaps reduce quite a bit now. But I think overall, the regulators are a lot more knowledgeable, a lot more capable. They've got access to a lot more technology now in terms of their focus and process. But agreeing with Daniel and Erik that I think the total focus that we're looking at now is really list-based screening, knowing your customer, KYC processes are still super important, but the primary driver here is really around sanction circumvention. And I think that's what we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years. And in current climate, the risks that we're seeing, I mean, the methods being used by actors, illicit actors and players in markets are only getting better. There's new typologies that are changing very regularly. And it leaves most of our customers that work with us at Windward with these dilemmas between the timelines that we're seeing between suspicious activity and actual designations coming in very quickly. And this causes some major issues for all of our customer base in terms of what's going to be next. So the key elements that were listed, obviously the grey and the dark fleet. The dark fleet's been around since North Korea, Iran, Venezuela. I think we're all very familiar with that. The new phenomenon from February 2022 was obviously the grey fleet, which was the Russia-related activities we started to see. These are increasing. The risk programs around them need to be more sophisticated. But I think overall, the biggest rise that we're seeing is almost what you could refer to as potentially the perfect crime. So this is what we call GNSS, or global navigation satellite systems, or spoofing, where vessels lay down false paths and false locations. I think we picked up about 3,600 instances of this over the last few years. It's something that we saw in the government sectors before it came to the commercial sectors. But even the best compliance and sanctions experts without the right technology are going to miss these things. And it isn't trivial to tell an owner or operator of a vessel that you believe they've been spoofing their locations. So again, the right technology to support that with humans in the loop, satellite imagery, is becoming super important. The dark activity piece, which again was heavily focused on in 2020, is we're seeing a decrease in dark activity in terms of vessels turning off their AIS systems. This is an area where essentially, I say older, less sophisticated technologies rely on a logic that determines that anything longer than, let's say, 48 hours should be looked at or investigated. And again, this creates a lot of noise, a lot of false positives, a lot of work for generally overstretched resources in sanctions and compliance teams. STS, big focus on that, as Daniel mentioned. But I think with STS, again, differentiating between actual cargo transfers or bunkering, crew, service events has become pivotal, again, in keeping the workload to a minimum. Along with STS, we're starting to see, as you normally do in and around war zones, more and more instances of GPS jamming. Not unusual, quite common around war zones. But the trend we're watching starting to grow now is vessels doing illicit activity under that cloak, under that cover of jamming, which creates a very it's not perfect, but it creates a cloak where people can activate STS transfers, do illicit things without with an excuse, if you like. Increases zombie vessels. I think obviously there's been lots of talk about that recently. We talked about this, I think, at the task force as well. Essentially dead or scrap vessels, their old identity being stolen and used. And I think obviously the landscape between regulators is causing a lot of complexity in terms of policy, process, what's coming next. And again, something both Daniel and Erik referred to was trade documentation. And again, this is an area where documents, verification of them, there's a ton of paperwork. involved in global trade. Whether you're financing, trading, insuring, there's a ton of paperwork, and obviously the verification of these documents is something that, as I said, we'll be doing a lot of work on, with some great results. But that overall is some of the key elements. And I think, again, I just wanted to refer to the fact that every single customer I've ever worked with, we work with as a group, as Windward, have different criteria. There is list-based screening. There's the ability to look at behavioral and illicit activity, deceptive practices. But then every company has its own organizational defined risk. And these are areas where we're using our technologies to help and support people, trying to monitor high-risk vessels that aren't designated, but obviously with the emphasis on pre-engagement, pre-finance, pre-fixture, pre-trade, whichever part of the industry you're in, with 80 to 85% of people's time being spent pre-engagement, it's important to know the vessels that we believe the regulators are looking at, because it's a hellish task if you get involved with one of those and it happens during a transaction. Hilla, back to you.
Thank you, Simon. It's the perfect gateway, as you said, that every organization has its own risk threshold and they have their own defined what is risk and what is risky to their bottom line, which is a great segue to Tom from RUSI. As we know, RUSI is ideally positioned in the kind of crossroads between the official regulators and the industry stakeholders. Now, as Simon said, every industry, every organization, every segment has their own way of looking at risk and defining it. Following the new advisory, what are you seeing or what are you hearing from the industry in your task force? What are people taking from it, and where are the big challenges or blind spots, let's say, that they have?
Well, thank you very much to you and your colleagues at Windward for the invitation and for people giving up their time to join us online. I should maybe explain what the task force is, because Simon talks about it as some kind of all-seeing eye, which of course it is. But it's we run a task force at RUSI on maritime sanctions. It's a mainly private sector gathering, but also we have some people from government who participate. And we set it up late last year, and Windward is a generous sponsor of the task force, which we set up to essentially try and deal with these questions that have been floating around since the beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine when it comes to implementing maritime sanctions. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the findings, the recent findings of our most recent meeting, which conveniently was just last week, because it addresses some of the points you raised. But I think the first thing I would say from a private sector perspective, as the others have indicated, is obviously a lot has happened in the last 5 years. And since the first Trump maximum pressure campaign, and Erik talked a lot about that. But one of the things that has happened is, from our perspective, is that the shipping industry has got the joke. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that in the 2017, 2018, I think it was, we wrote a paper at RUSI which we called Underwriting Proliferation. And it was about essentially the way in which the shipping community, and in particular the insurance sector, hadn't really realized that there were things called UN Security Council resolutions against North Korea. And this is when all the kind of ship-to-ship transfers were going on and so forth. And let's just say that it was not a popular report. Now, I think if we wrote a paper like that, people will go, absolutely, you're quite right. We're fully behind the mission of trying to implement maritime sanctions, and particularly in Europe, obviously that's been driven by the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and so that I think has driven a degree of awareness, and I'm sure from a Windward perspective, it's driven a significant degree of kind of increase in engagement. And if you're a lawyer in this space like Daniel, again, a significant increase in engagement, just general awareness in the private sector that this is a thing you should care about, point one. And then point two, with the return of Donald Trump to the White House, and obviously the clear focus on the Iran file to the exclusion when it comes to sanctions, at any rate, of the Russia file, is that awareness that you've built over the last few years because of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine needs to also be reflected on the Iran side of the ledger. And there is no shortage of examples coming out of US Treasury over the last 3 or 4 months that you can work with to kind of really see the reality of the warnings that are in the advisory that others have been talking about. I think the one point that I would add perhaps to this, which we've talked about a lot in our task force, or 2 points. First is this whole question of, this is not just about knowing what the vessels are doing, right? This is the whole infrastructure around the oil trade is at risk of being sanctioned, of touching the third rail and getting a nasty shock. So you start seeing captains of vessels being sanctioned, for example, or brokers, or people who sold vessels into the shadow fleet. It's a much bigger community that is in the spotlight now. So I think that's the first thing. So if you were sitting on the edge of that community 5 years ago and thought, oh, you know what, I don't really need to worry about this too much, wrong. Now you are definitely in the crosshairs, and you need to make sure you understand the implications of the sanctions advisory from OFAC. And the second thing is, and one of the others touched on it briefly earlier on, is the whole question of the role of flag registries and the responsibility of flag registries, which maybe we can come on to talk about a bit more in a minute. But the last point I would say is that, and I'm preaching to the converted here, which is that there remains, I think, quite a big gap between what policymakers, whether it's at OFAC or anywhere else, what policymakers want the private sector to do, and converting that into language that the private sector can actually understand. So, I mean, the advisory, I think, it's very clearly written, and as the others have said, there is no excuse for, it's hardly kind of sort of the Game of Thrones, right? It's quite short, it's simple, and you can see the messages there. You then need to implement those. I think where things have got more complicated for industry is that over the last few years around, and we might start seeing this in the context of Iran as well, policymakers have very ambitious mission when it comes to using sanctions in the context of maritime activity. And I'm not sure that policymakers always understand how industry works. And so in trying to get industry to do something, they can be a bit cat-handed in their formulation of policy. And I think that's where those of us who are lucky enough to sort of operate between the two sides need to step up. But in summary, I would say from an industry perspective, much more awareness now. There are many more tools that can be used, like you guys at Windward offer, in a way that there weren't that degree of sophistication 4 or 5 years ago. So in a way, there's no excuse. You kind of have been warned, and you should comply.
Thank you. We definitely see it, and we feel it ourselves if we get the new advisory coming out, and then even us as domain experts and technology experts need a minute to translate it into models or behaviors that can be flagged, or processes that stakeholders can start to do the next morning. Which also leads me, both Daniel and Erik. Erik, let's start with you. So it is very clear in the advisory what good compliance is, but on a practical note, what do stakeholders, or from your perspective, from your experience, what do regulators expect from stakeholders to actually do in a practical way, day-to-day language?
I think that's a really important question, and I'll make a few points, and then perhaps you can have a back and forth among the participants. I think there's room for a rich discussion. So one, I can highlight something that's been a consistent theme in OFAC's advisories: the directive to leverage available resources. As new tools to investigate, monitor, and conduct diligence emerge and become available, the expectation to use them also increases. OFAC tends to be careful not to be too prescriptive in its general guidance, but you should be surveying new and existing tools to consider whether you're using them effectively as part of a risk-based compliance program. And to put kind of a finer point on it, you should also assume that government investigators have access to these tools and will be looking at the same data as they investigate evasion actors, networks, and practices. So if you're not seeing it, you're not seeing what the government, in part at least, is surely looking at. Second, I never try to miss a chance to emphasize the importance of risk assessments. You aren't conducting and appropriately updating a risk assessment. You cannot fully understand the risks that you need to address in your compliance program. Your program might not need every new fancy tool, but you should have reasons that are grounded in an understanding of your sanctions risks for the nature and the extent of diligence that you're performing. If you're exposed to risks of location manipulation, for example, then you should be looking at available tools to mitigate those risks, including services that help flag evidence of manipulation. Last, as a general point, as important as it is to incorporate new information and approaches into your compliance and diligence process, I still think that more remains the same than different in this arena. Good compliance is still a multi-part effort that includes management commitment, risk assessment, effective controls and processes, audit and testing, and training. I hesitate to single out any single element to highlight because all of these elements of a program remain critical, and neglecting any of them can invite the next violation or just the next difficult to unravel headache. So, I would urge the audience to not lose sight of the forest for the trees as you're studying this new information and advisories. Make sure that you're putting it into a structure that overall makes sense and remains robust across all of these different elements of an effective compliance program.
Thank you. Daniel, do you have anything else to add on top of that?
Yeah, I thought it was worth sort of drawing out a couple of threads that occurred to me reading through the guidance, because I think one of the things that I read into the guidance and perhaps overread into it is if you look at some of the comments around mitigating risk around cargo and around flag and around documents, the message that I take from those is be suspicious, look for the things that should trigger more suspicion and ask more questions. And that, to some extent, that gives me a bit of comfort from the perspective of advising clients on dealing with the regulator, because I think what we've seen, primarily from OFAC, but also other regulators, is a huge amount of effort on their part to educate and upskill and understand the industry. And I think they are much better now at understanding the complexity of it. But I think that message, which is a sort of consistent message, and Erik's talked to it about people trusting their instincts and being suspicious and asking questions, I think is important. I think that's a good thing. On the flip side, I think there is still an element of silver bulleting in the guidance when it comes to the contract protection side. My reading of the sections that deal with contracts is there are two elements to what they're expecting in terms of contracts. There's an expectation that you'll have a warranty of compliance, probably with US sanctions, from your counterparty, even if neither of you are subject to the jurisdiction. So that sort of assumes that you can negotiate that and that people are willing to give that level of warranty. But I think also there is a constant tension between, is mere contractual promise that you'll follow the rules good enough for a regulator when you find that your counterparty doesn't and then exposes you? And I would still say that the position is that while it's nice to have the contractual protections, ultimately sanctions compliance is your primary responsibility. And contractual protections will take you only so far, which is a contractual remedy against your counterpart, and to some extent an ability to demonstrate to a regulator that you took it seriously and you contracted properly. But ultimately, if you're facing internal investigation, OFAC investigation, self-reporting, the content doesn't necessarily help. And I think the other element, I think where things are potentially more challenging, and commercial people on the call will be familiar with this, is that expectation that you will have a contractual termination right is becoming baked into the guidance. But of course, when you come to exercise that contractual right, you are faced with a difficult quandary because you have to be right. Unless the contractual termination right is drafted in very broad terms and allows you to terminate on the basis of a suspicion or a risk or a feeling, the mere existence of that right isn't necessarily the silver bullet. And I think, therefore, really sort of feeding into the question of compliance, whether you're engaging in compliance checks in order to ensure you're not doing anything wrong, or you're engaging in compliance checks to build the case to exercise the contractual right, the end point is the same, is getting as much information as you can. But from a contractual position and in terms of terminating, and if you are the owner and you have a long-term time charter and you have concerns around charter's activities, terminating that charter is not necessarily straightforward because of some of those concerns that might arise. So I suppose where we get to really is drafting those contract provisions in as broad terms as you can negotiate to give as many rights as possible. And we've seen the English court recently grappling with questions around whether non-compliance with US rules is effective to engage contractual provisions as a matter of English law. And that is something that's going to continue. So I think, yes, so those are sort of the things that it seems to me is the sort of recognition that the landscape is difficult, but also a sort of perhaps an over-reliance on contractual protection.
Maybe just jump in a second, because this is exactly the core of the pushback that we used to get when we had this conversation with people, which is that obviously most people that come to the sanctions topic tend to come from a banking background where things are much more tightly drawn. You can block a transaction, you can freeze an account, whatever it might be, and still from time to time when talking with people in the shipping industry, I hear the kind of, it's difficult and we've got these protections, and we all know that with insurance, right, you don't need it and until you need it, and unfortunately stuff can go on in the meantime and you just simply can't be aware of it, which is why I think some of the kind of due diligence points that the advisory makes, and there's a question about flag registries which maybe we should answer as well in a second, but some of the due diligence points are really important because you kind of need to stop yourself being exposed to that breadth of issue which you were talking about, Daniel, not actually take the client on in the first, or the vessel on in the first instance, but that means you need to do much more due diligence at inception rather than waiting until things go wrong and go, oh well, you breached the terms, so sorry, we're not going to pay out. Well, by that stage, that vessel might have carried millions of barrels of oil and done significant damage to the national security, the national security ambition. So this, I think, and this is one of the things I mean about when you talk about to policymakers, they're rooted in, how would we deal with a bank? Well, this industry couldn't be more different.
I completely agree. We said also, I feel that the language in the advisory is very do your due diligence and that's it. And it's not a point, it's not a single point process. It has to continue until the deal is ended, the term is ended, the contract is ended. Because as you said, Tom, something can go wrong along the way. And if you find out after the fact or after the vessel your cargo is already on has been sanctioned, that's way too late. You need that 1 minute before to see who it met with or who it's about to meet with or what area it's about to enter to be able to mitigate it in a proactive way. Simon, anything else you want to add before we move on?
I wanted to come back on Tom's point, because I think that is the key to all of this. But commercially, there are issues that people face in terms of speed to market, speed of execution, automation of process. It's well and good to say to people, spend 85% of your time pre-fixture, pre-finance, pre-trade, whatever, whichever industry sector you come, pre-insurance. But it's the time that takes. And what I tend to see, I sort of go back to when King's College and well, it was all about stopping North Korea getting nuclear weapons about 12, 14 years ago. But the markets today, I think, what I see is this kind of, I call it a vicious cycle. So people go to the business and they say, I need some technology. They buy technology. They go back to the business and they say, it's worse than I thought. I've got a ton of alerts. And I need more people to come in and look at these alerts. And they give them more resource. Then a couple of months later, they realize that 90% of what they're doing is a waste of their time. And that goes on. And I meet people with those scars daily. And I think, in essence, the fact that now we are looking at such a more broad area, Tom, you mentioned, insurance, that was always aimed at P&I clubs. I think that's starting to differ away to cargo insurance now. I think they're seeing different areas, brokers, you talked about, sale and purchase, flag administrations. I think we've seen some of the more established, better run flag administrations towing the line and doing the right things, even though it must be very frustrating to watch this tonnage go elsewhere and still have the right to trade. But I think personally, now we're starting to get into an area in markets I haven't seen before, where people are starting to look at how they operate, the technologies they use, how they use them. And I think, the ton of work we're doing in Gen AI, trade automation, document verification is all starting to play into that narrative where you can do this and you can do it very quickly, very efficiently. If you added up all the risks, some of the things that OFAC talks about, STS, dark activity, GNSS, honestly, in terms of global trade, the percentage of illicit activity on our oceans is quite small, but it's becoming more difficult to find it and spot it. New typologies, changes in the way actors and players do things. So I think sophistication in technology is super key. It will save you a ton of time, a ton of resource, a ton of that commercial element of getting to market, getting to process quicker, by using more sophisticated technology that does the heavy lifting. I don't know, Hill, if we're going to come back to this. I was going to cover some of those other points. Shall I do that now or later?
Yeah, you can go ahead. It also relates to the question we got in the Q&A. So after talk
Yeah,
about technology, and we'll take the question afterwards.
I think the essence of certainly us and companies in our area that work across the broad areas of trade and finance has to be about business enablement. It's got to be about enabling business to flow and capturing the risk. And I think if you design technologies, we talked about the OFAC top 5 here. I mean, the biggest blight growing is vessel spoofing, right? And again, it is not trivial to accuse an owner operator of a vessel that they're manipulating their location. You need advanced technologies, you need humans in the loop, you need satellite imagery to really make sure that you understand that risk. STS modeling, if you can determine it's an actual cargo transport, not a bunkering or service event, you're saving a ton of time again. AIS gaps, if you're investigating everything over 48 hours, a legacy solution, you're probably one of those people that talk to us about 85% of your time being wasted in investigating false positives. Because I think this is where these kind of lost and found events, understanding the satellite coverage in the area, the vessels, the timelines, all of this takes away and gives, I think, compliance and sanctions core teams the time to do what they should be doing, which is investigating these real events rather than wasting a lot of time, looking at things that are just false positives. I think the other thing, just to add in summary very quickly, is the risk comes in various different formats, right? We look at a very disrupted kind of supply chain area right now, and it isn't just sanctions. It can be Red Sea risk, it can be strikes, it can be weather, it can be a whole multitude of things, all have a cause and effect on business. And allowing people to design and define their own risks within your technologies and solutioning is becoming absolutely key. We talked, Tom, about a lot about the ship act list more recently at the task force, right? Stop harboring Iranian petroleum. 50% of that list is still out there operating. And we have to be clear that we know the regulators will be focused on things like that. So building that all in is all about pre-engagement process to ensure that you don't come into work on Monday and find that a vessel that you're operating with or financing, insuring, whatever, is on a list.
Definitely. The technology, and I'm sure the rest of the panel can agree, to keep up with the regulator has to be agile and dynamic and enable organizations to define their own risk, because as Simon said, not every organization will want to highlight the same risk. And it makes a lot of difference if you can get the technology to work for you and just flag those risks that matter to your bottom line at that specific moment. And I want to read out the question we get before we sum up the webinar. We got a question about how OFAC sanctions lists based on their claimed flag states, but we're seeing that there's a lot of fraud when it comes to flag registries, like in the recent, with the recent Guyana flagged vessels in the late 2024 sanctioned vessels, and then Guyana said that they were never actually registered there. So Erik or Tom, from a legal perspective, does the guidance address verifying flag state legitimacy in any way?
There is indeed a section called Verify Flag State Registration or Flag Registration. So I think the short answer is yes. But I mean, this is a growing problem. So you had an example there from Guyana. The Estonians stopped a vessel recently in the Baltic Sea, which was, I think, allegedly flagged at somewhere I had never heard of. But of course, and the important thing is that because it was false flagged, it allowed the Estonians to board the vessel in a way that, had it been correctly flagged, perhaps they wouldn't have done. What the one half of our recent task force meeting was precisely about essentially how do you bring integrity to the flag registry system. And dare I say it, those that should oversee flag registries and integrity are not doing the job that they should be doing. And one should be increasingly suspicious of flagging. There are, as it mentions here, there are some tools that one can use, but I don't think they are as effective as they could be. In this day and age, if we're going to improve flag registry standards, we're going to need universal agreement around the table. That's not going to happen in this kind of geo-fragmented world that we live in. So I think there is a gap here for innovation that can help help determine, if you like, risk assess registries. And as a private sector actor, just as you might risk assess a country for its money laundering vulnerabilities, you need to also risk assess a flag registry for its track record of supporting illicit activity.
Definitely. Erik, anything to add?
I think Tom hit the main points that I would make. I mean, obviously, this is now a challenge that is on the radar of both industry and the regulators. As Tom noted, I think the tricky part is there isn't an easy solution to it right now. And so until there is, it's going to be a matter of figuring out how to assess risks associated with particular fact patterns, whether those are risks associated with particular registries or other red flags that may suggest that the flag claimed by the vessel is not legitimate. I think it's going to be a matter of trying to incorporate those risk factors into your compliance program. And then and also keep an eye out for, as Tom noted, there's scope for innovation here for more rapid, real-time, and reliable verification.
For sure. Danielle?
I think the question that I've always had, and it's partly ignorance on my part, is whether the flags could publish on their website the list of vessels which they flag. And it seems to me that in that way, they control that information. And the sort of point around the Register Information Compact and sharing that information between flags, actually, if you had a dynamic list that showed who was currently flagged, that yes, there is an administrative requirement on flags to keep it up to date. But actually, I mean, I don't know, it'd be interesting to hear from the audience how often people are confronted with false flag states and perhaps sort of building a solution that doesn't really need to exist because it's relatively small. But it does seem to me that it's objectively verifiable. It is either, it's a binary question, is the vessel flagged where it says it is? And if flag was to publish that information, then we would have a register to refer back to. But I think Tom knows more and is going to correct me.
I was going to say, it's like a sort of simpler version of the ultimate beneficial ownership argument. You have a company register, companies are registered there. Is that register open access, as it is in the UK? Is it non-existent, as it is in some countries? or is it, you know, legitimate interest access only? But I don't know the answer. I'd have thought that if the information was out there, it would have been scraped up by, you know, AI machines by now, and clearly that's not happening.
Definitely. And we got another question about if there's a risk assessment official body that kind of recognizes the information. As Daniel suggested, I don't think that there's any such official body that summarizes this information currently, but I do want to offer another take on it. As we do with every risk indicator, when we look at it, how we look at it at least, it's not a single risk indicator and not a single activity or a single flagging as a standalone activity. You have to look at the wider context, meaning if a vessel has just recently changed ownership and changes trade lanes to start working in specific risky areas, plus reflagged a flag of convenience or kind of a suspicious flag registry, everything adds up to something you need to look further into. Don't just look at reflagging, you have to look at the wider context of how vessels behave.
It's interesting, Tom. We talked a little bit about this at our last meeting, I know. And I guess from the government's perspective, certainly in the UK, foreign policy plays a role here in kind of publishing a good or a bad list. They kind of already exist. They're out there. The Paris MOU, people can use that. But the challenge really is when some of the major administrations do the right thing, and we've seen Panama do that recently and others, you get to a point where if these vessels are just going to reflag somewhere else, they can still trade. So you're not solving the problem. I think the problem fundamentally, in my head anyway, the thing to me is if you have industry defining, looking at a list of well-run flag administrations, you know, and avoiding the less well-run flag administrations, then the business stays with the good guys, which is what you're trying to achieve, I think. But I know foreign policies are part. I don't know if you mention anything on that, Tom.
Well, I mean, I'm always drawn at moments like this to the Financial Action Task Force, which will probably mean nothing to most people who are listening, but it is, as I like to call it, the most powerful organization no one's ever heard of, and it's why you have to show your passport and your driving license and your utility bills every time you want to do anything with your bank. But that obviously assesses countries around the world, and those that don't meet the agreed standards are put on this so-called grey list, and in so doing are designated high risk. And some countries, the UK being one example, the EU being another example, take that grey list and say, right, in light of that grey listing, you have to operate differently, Bank X, Bank Y, if you want to deal with that particular country. Fundamentally, I think the conclusion of our last task force meeting on this was the IMO needs to get its act together. You know, ultimately, it is responsible for this. And it doesn't appear to be following through on its responsibilities. And if it's not going to do that, we need to find another way of doing it. And at a time, as I said earlier, where we have kind of geopolitical fragmentation, that's probably going to be a kind of a private sector or a kind of, you know, G7 plus private sector solution that allows the good guys to demonstrate that they're the good guys. And by definition, if you're not willing to sign up to this way of operating, then you should be viewed as high risk. But I'm not a policymaker or a foreign policy expert, so I would have probably just caused a diplomatic incident.
Thank you all. I want to be mindful of the time, and I just want to leave our audiences with one last tip from each and every one of you. Erik, we can start with you. Considering the 2020 advisory was chapter 1, 2025 was chapter 2, what do you think will be chapter 3 for global regulators? And what is the one thing that our audience can do tomorrow morning to start and be more proactive about this?
Thank you. Thanks to all our panelists for, I thought, a great discussion. In terms of what's next, I have been watching as we've seen the rise of export controls as a tool used in many ways similar to the way sanctions are used, and an increasing focus on the movement, not only and leverage derived from not only financial flows, but also the movement of goods and services. I'll be watching in the coming years for greater interest and perhaps pressure from governments on the private sector to know more and more about the goods that are being paid for in transactions that they're processing for the financial sector. For our current audience, the goods that are being transported as well. I think the momentum in the regulatory marketplaces towards wanting the private sector to have greater visibility and control than they have historically. So I would watch for that, ways in which that might develop in the coming years. In terms of one thing to do tomorrow, it's really hard to get down to one. I'll be quick. First, if you haven't done a risk assessment or updated it recently, do that urgently. Second, examine your compliance program against the typologies and measures that OFAC has highlighted, not only in the most recent guidance, but going back before that as well. And to take Daniel's point, consider if your organization is being sufficiently suspicious and critical in assessing what you're told. There's an October compliance communique from last year that goes through a number of case studies, and I think really highlights this emphasis on being suspicious and somebody raising their hand and saying, "Hey, this doesn't make sense," and that is what drives, the unraveling of the given evasion scheme. And then third, just because I often see these not working as intended, give a close look at your contractual controls to ensure they provide appropriate grounds to terminate or suspend performance in the case that performance would expose you to sanctions risks. And I agree with the point that Daniel made earlier. When I talk about contractual provisions here, I mostly am talking about the provisions that would allow you to terminate or suspend performance in case you identify sanctions risks. I'm not talking about the warranties, which, as Daniel noted, are important. I mean, you should have those warranties, but they are certainly not sufficient and need to just be part of a multi-part strategy to manage your sanctions risks. Back to you.
Thank you. Daniel?
Yeah, I agree with Erik's points. I suppose a couple of additional things to add. I think in terms of what happens next, I think my concern is that we see more bifurcation. I think we have a focus on good actors and bad actors, and we've all talked at various points about ensuring that we deal with the good people, as we put it. But I think increasingly we're getting closer and closer to that tipping point where there is an entire parallel chain, whether it's insurance, whether it's flag, whether it's banking, whether it's transactional. And my slight concern with that is that we end up with people stuck in the middle between those who are deliberately part of that parallel trade, those who are structured and teched and able to manage to stay on the right side, and there's a sort of rump in the middle. They're having to struggle with those relationships. So I think that for me is probably chapter 3 over the next 12 months or so, and manage individual people, I suppose, managing where they are in that continuum.
Interesting.
And in terms of things to do tomorrow, I mean, I'd agree with Erik. I think the one thing I'd perhaps emphasize, and where I've seen the sort of most success, and Simon touched on this, but is working out where in your commercial and contracting chain you gather information from counterparties. Where do you get your KYC? And how early can you put that in the chain? Can you ensure that at a point that you are still in commercial discussions, the KYC is front and center, rather than it being the thing that you come to at the end when you're trying to dot I's and cross T's on a contract and everyone's sort of moved on to the next thing. So that for me is important.
Thank you. And Tom, in 30 seconds.
I'll be very brief. If your head is in the sand, take it out, because policymakers are a one-way ratchet. It only you see it now. Once they start to think, oh, the maritime industry, we should focus on that to a greater extent. The layers get added, and the circle of focus expands. So if you don't think this, applies to you, it probably does. It's just you haven't realized it yet.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for your time and for joining us today. Have a great weekend.